From the moment Luffy ate the Gomu Gomu no Mi, his fate changed forever. Instead of laughing off Luffy's claims of wanting to be a pirate, Shanks saw an opportunity, one that could shape the future in an entirely new direction. Unlike in the original timeline, where Shanks left Luffy behind to carve his own path, this time, the red-haired captain made a different choice. He decided to take Luffy aboard the red-haired pirates and train him himself. Shanks had always admired Luffy's determination. Despite his young age, the boy had an unshakable will and an infectious dream. When Luffy ate the devil fruit, it solidified Shanks' belief that the boy had great potential. But with that power also came responsibility. If left on his own, Luffy might never fully master the abilities of his devil fruit, and worse, he could become an easy target for those seeking to exploit him. Rather than leaving Luffy behind, Shanks made a bold decision. He would take the boy under his wing, guiding him toward greatness. With this choice, history began to shift. Shanks and his crew left Fushou village earlier than in the original story, meaning they were never there when Higuma, the mountain bandit, kidnapped Luffy. As a result, Shanks never had to sacrifice his arm to save him from the Sea King. Instead, as the red-haired pirate set sail with Luffy on board, the young boy was filled with excitement and joy. His dream had come true. He was finally a pirate. However, what Luffy didn't expect was that his new life would be far from the thrilling adventure he had imagined. Luffy had envisioned himself immediately fighting alongside Shanks and his legendary crew, taking down enemies and exploring the Grand Line. But reality hit him hard. He wasn't a warrior. He wasn't even a proper crewmate yet. He was a cabin boy, the lowest rank on the ship. His responsibilities were far from glamorous. Luffy spent his days scrubbing the deck, cleaning the crew's mess, assisting in the kitchen, and fetching supplies for the officers. When the ship docked at an island, he was often tasked with carrying barrels of food and water back onto the ship. The work was exhausting, and to make matters worse, whenever a battle occurred, he was forbidden from fighting. Instead, he had to stand back and watch as Shanks and his crew handled any threats with ease. At first, Luffy was frustrated. He wanted to prove himself, to show Shanks that he could be a great pirate. He begged for a chance to fight, but every time, the answer was the same. Not yet. Though disappointed, Luffy slowly began to understand that his training had already begun. Life on a pirate ship wasn't just about fighting, it was about survival. Under the watchful eyes of the crew, he learned discipline, teamwork, and the fundamentals of sailing. Ben Beckman, Shanks' right-hand man, took it upon himself to educate Luffy on navigation. He taught him how to read maps, understand ocean currents, and predict the weather. Lucky Roo and Yasopp drilled him on basic survival skills, how to conserve food, avoid dangerous sea creatures, and recognize hostile territories. Most importantly, Luffy learned about the world itself. Unlike in the original timeline, where he set sail with little knowledge beyond the stories Garp told him, this time he was exposed to the truth early on. He learned about the four emperors, the warlords of the sea, the world government, and the immense power struggles that shaped the world. He listened as Shanks and his officers discussed legendary figures like Gold D. Roger, Monkey D. Dragon, and Whitebeard. For the first time, Luffy realized that the world was far bigger and more dangerous than he had imagined. Despite being forbidden from fighting, Luffy watched the red-haired pirates in action countless times. He saw how effortlessly Shanks' crew dispatched enemies, relying on their combat skills and strategy rather than brute force. One thing stood out to him: none of them had devil fruit powers. This fascinated Luffy. If they didn't have special abilities, how were they so strong? His curiosity grew until he finally asked Ben Beckman about it. Beckman chuckled and gave him a simple answer: because we have something better than devil fruits. That was when Luffy was introduced to Haki for the first time. Though he didn't fully understand it yet, the idea that strength could come from within rather than from a devil fruit planted a seed in his mind. As the months passed, Luffy slowly earned the respect of the crew. Though still young and inexperienced, his spirit never wavered. He tackled every task with enthusiasm, even when he failed. His unwavering determination reminded Shanks of someone: his former captain, Gold D. Roger. One night, after a grand feast aboard the ship, Shanks sat beside Luffy and spoke to him about Roger for the first time. He told stories of the Pirate King's adventures, of his strength, and his unwavering will. Luffy listened with wide eyes, absorbing every word. It was in that moment that he made his bold declaration. One day, I'm going to be king of the pirates. The entire crew erupted into laughter, but Shanks simply smiled. He saw something familiar in the boy's eyes. That same unbreakable resolve. That same belief in an impossible dream. Though he didn't say it, Shanks knew deep down, Luffy had the potential to achieve it. With each passing day, Luffy grew stronger, not just physically, but mentally. He learned the ways of a true pirate, gaining knowledge and experience that would have taken him years to acquire on his own. This version of Luffy was very different from the one who had set out alone in the original story. He was more disciplined, more aware of the world, and already on the path to mastering Haki. But as much as he learned aboard the red-haired pirate's ship, his journey was only beginning. The seas ahead were vast and unpredictable, and even with Shanks as his mentor, Luffy's greatest challenges were yet to come. For now, however, he embraced the life of a pirate, not as a captain, but as a disciple of one of the most legendary crews in history. After spending months as a cabin boy aboard the red-haired pirate ship, Luffy finally began to grasp the fundamentals of life at sea. He had learned discipline, navigation, and the daily routines necessary to survive as a pirate. However, one thing still bothered him. Despite his excitement and dedication, he was still not allowed to fight. Luffy was determined to change that. He had watched Shanks and his crew in action numerous times and noticed that none of them relied on devil fruits. Yet, they were some of the strongest fighters he had ever seen. He needed to know their secret. One day, after finishing his daily chores, Luffy approached Ben Beckman, Shanks' right-hand man, and asked, "Teach me how to fight like you guys. I want to be strong too." Beckman, who had been watching Luffy's growth, smirked. "Fighting isn't just about swinging your fists, kid. You need to train your mind and body first. If you really want to learn, you better be ready to suffer." Luffy grinned. "I can handle anything." And so, his true training began. Beckman started by explaining the concept of Haki, a mysterious power that allowed a person to sense enemies, strengthen their attacks, and even intimidate others. There are 3 types of Haki, Beckman told Luffy. Observation Haki, which lets you sense people and predict attacks. Armament Haki, which lets you harden your body and strike with incredible force. And Conqueror's Haki, which is a rare ability that can overpower the will of others. Luffy listened with wide eyes, barely able to contain his excitement. He wanted to master all of it immediately. But Beckman shut down his enthusiasm quickly. Before you even think about Conqueror's Haki, you need to get the basics down. First, you're going to learn Observation Haki. Observation Haki was all about sensing the world without relying on sight. To train Luffy's instincts, Beckman blindfolded him and made him go about his daily chores without using his eyes. At first, it was a disaster. Luffy tripped over barrels, bumped into crewmates, and even knocked over an entire stack of supplies. The crew laughed at his struggles, but Beckman remained firm. "Stop relying on your eyes. Listen, feel the movement around you. Sense what's coming before it happens." Luffy, stubborn as ever, kept at it. Over time, he started noticing subtle shifts in the air, the sound of footsteps approaching, and even the presence of crew members without seeing them. Once he got better at navigating blindfolded, Beckman took things a step further. Now, Luffy had to dodge attacks while blindfolded. Beckman and Yasopp would throw objects at him. Wooden sticks, fruit, and even buckets of water. At first, Luffy got hit every time. But slowly, his instincts sharpened. He began dodging before the objects even made contact. His reflexes improved, and soon, he was reacting before the attack was even launched. One day, Beckman threw a small rock at him, and Luffy dodged effortlessly. The crew members watching were impressed. "He's picking it up fast," Yasopp remarked. Beckman nodded. "Yeah, the kid's got talent." With a solid foundation in Observation Haki, Luffy was ready to learn Armament Haki, the ability to coat his body in an invisible armor to strengthen his attacks and defend against blows. To train him, Beckman used a simple but brutal method. Luffy had to break solid wooden logs with his bare hands. The first time Luffy tried, he only hurt himself. His punches landed with force, but there was no special power behind them. Beckman explained that Armament Haki was about focusing one's willpower into a hardened force. To make things even harder, Beckman placed Luffy in a combat drill, he had to spar against Yasopp and Lucky Roo without using his devil fruit powers. At first, Luffy was completely overwhelmed. No matter how many times he punched, his attacks barely did any damage. Meanwhile, the crewmates hit him effortlessly. "You're still relying too much on brute strength," Beckman scolded. "Focus your energy. Channel it into your fists." Luffy gritted his teeth and tried again. Day after day, he practiced, getting punched, knocked down, and thrown around. His knuckles bled from punching wooden targets, but he never gave up. One night, after weeks of failure, something changed. Luffy clenched his fist, focusing all his energy into his strike. When he punched the log this time, it shattered into pieces. The crew went silent for a moment. Then, Beckman smirked. "Now you're getting it." Now that Luffy had the basics of both observation and armament haki, it was time for the final test, a combat challenge. The crew set up a sparring session where Luffy had to fight blindfolded while using both haki abilities at once. His task was to dodge incoming attacks while countering with armament-enhanced strikes. At first, he struggled. Being unable to see made it difficult to land solid hits. But his observation haki had improved, and soon, he could sense the attacks coming before they landed. As he fought, his strikes became stronger, his reflexes sharper. After a long, exhausting battle, Luffy landed a decisive punch, knocking Yasopp back. The crew erupted in cheers. Shanks, who had been watching from a distance, finally stepped forward. "You've done well, Luffy," he said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You're finally getting strong." Luffy grinned, his eyes full of determination. "I'm not stopping here. I'll keep getting stronger until I'm the best." The crew laughed, but deep down, they all knew Luffy was becoming a true warrior. This was only the beginning. 3 years had passed since Luffy first set sail with the red-haired pirates. What had started as a frustrating experience, scrubbing decks and doing chores, had transformed into a journey of intense growth. Under the guidance of Shanks, Ben Beckman, and the rest of the crew, Luffy had become a formidable warrior. He had trained relentlessly, mastering observation and armament haki through rigorous drills. Now, at the age of 14, he was finally given the chance to prove himself in battle. The opportunity came when the red-haired pirates clashed with a rival crew in the New World. This wasn't just a small skirmish. This was a full-scale battle against an infamous pirate fleet that had been causing havoc across multiple islands. Luffy, eager to fight, stood at the edge of the ship, watching as Shanks and his officers prepared for combat. "You're ready," Beckman said, handing Luffy his sword. Luffy blinked in surprise. "I don't use swords." "You won't need it," Beckman smirked. "Just focus, use your haki, and prove you belong here." As the battle broke out, Luffy launched himself into the fray. His observation haki allowed him to anticipate enemy movements before they attacked, making him nearly untouchable. With each strike, his armament haki-infused punches crushed bones and sent opponents flying. The once reckless boy who relied solely on brute force now fought with precision and skill. By the end of the battle, the enemy crew had been completely overwhelmed. Luffy had taken down more than a dozen opponents on his own, shocking even some of the senior members of the red-haired pirates. "You're not a cabin boy anymore," Lucky Roo laughed, slapping Luffy on the back. "You're one of us now." Luffy beamed, feeling a sense of belonging unlike anything he had experienced before. Over the next few years, Luffy continued to grow stronger. By the time he was 17, he had solidified his place among the red-haired pirates as one of their key fighters. He could now take on entire enemy crews on his own, barely breaking a sweat. His speed and reaction time were almost supernatural, his observation haki refined to near perfection. His armament haki allowed him to take on even the toughest foes, breaking through their defenses with ease. Even Shanks himself was impressed. One evening, after a particularly difficult battle, he watched as Luffy stood among defeated enemies, his straw hat tilted forward, a confident grin on his face. "You remind me of someone," Shanks muttered. "Who?" Luffy asked. Shanks chuckled. "Roger." Luffy didn't fully understand the weight of those words, but he knew one thing. He was getting closer to becoming the strongest pirate in the world. However, while Luffy was thriving, the world outside of his journey was changing for the worse. While Luffy was growing stronger under Shanks' guidance, his absence in East Blue led to catastrophic consequences. In the original timeline, Luffy's journey had brought hope to those who suffered under the rule of tyrants and villains. But without him, fate had taken a much darker path. In the original timeline, Luffy had saved Zoro from execution at the hands of Marine Captain Morgan. But in this alternate reality, no one came to help him. After standing up to Helmeppo and Captain Morgan, Zoro was left chained to a post, starving and wounded. Without Luffy to intervene, Morgan carried out his execution without hesitation. The infamous pirate hunter never got the chance to fulfill his dream. His swords rusted away, and his legend never began. Luffy had freed Nami from Arlong's control, shattering his reign of terror. But this time, she had no savior. With no Straw Hat crew to stop him, Arlong remained in power, tightening his grip on Kokoyasi village. Nami was forced to continue working as his cartographer, desperately trying to buy the village's freedom, a goal that would never be reached. Without Luffy's interference, the Marines in the area continued to ignore Arlong's crimes, allowing him to rule without opposition. Nami's suffering continued indefinitely. Trapped in a cycle of fear and hopelessness. One of Luffy's most significant encounters was with Sanji at the Barity. In the original story, Luffy helped defeat the pirate Don Krieg, ensuring the safety of the floating restaurant. But without Luffy, Krieg's invasion played out very differently. The Barity fell under Krieg's assault, and the chefs who once worked there were either killed or enslaved. Sanji, refusing to bow down, fought with all his might. But against Krieg's overwhelming forces, he stood no chance. In a tragic turn of fate, Sanji met his end protecting his mentor, Zeph. The man who once dreamed of finding the All Blue was now just another casualty in the brutal world of piracy. Usopp's lies about pirates attacking his village had always been dismissed as nothing more than tall tales. But when the Black Cat pirates, led by Captain Kuro, actually arrived, there was no one to stop them. Without Luffy, Zoro, and Nami to fight alongside him, Usopp had no real chance of defending Syrup Village. He fought bravely, but his skills were nowhere near enough to defeat Kuro's crew. In the end, Usopp was struck down while trying to protect his best friend, Kaya. His slingshot lay broken at his side, his dreams of becoming a great warrior of the sea unfulfilled. Kaya, without anyone to rescue her, was manipulated into believing Kuro's lies and ultimately met a tragic fate herself. Luffy's absence had turned East Blue into a much darker place. The villains he had once defeated now reigned unchallenged. Innocent lives were lost, dreams were crushed, and the hope that Luffy had once brought never existed. While Luffy had become a powerful warrior in the New World, the world he left behind had suffered greatly. He had no idea that his decision to sail with Shanks had sealed the fate of so many people who, in another timeline, would have been his closest friends. The world was changing, and soon, Luffy would have to face the consequences of his choices. Luffy's absence in East Blue had already led to devastating consequences, but the changes didn't stop there. Without Luffy's influence, the Grand Line itself became an even more chaotic and dangerous place. Many of the events that had once shaped history took a darker turn, leading to suffering and destruction on a much larger scale. In the original timeline, Luffy had met Tony Chopper on Drum Island and convinced him to join his crew. With Luffy's encouragement, Chopper found the courage to chase his dreams and become a doctor who could cure any disease. But in this version of history, no one arrived on Drum Island to challenge Wapol and liberate the people. With no one to oppose him, Wapol returned to Drum Kingdom after being exiled and reclaimed his throne. His cruelty knew no bounds, and under his rule, the island suffered greatly. The citizens had no choice but to submit to his tyranny once again. Meanwhile, Chopper remained hidden in the mountains, continuing to live as an outcast. He never got the chance to meet a crew that accepted him. He never learned about the vast world beyond his island. He never found the courage to stand up for himself. Dr. Kira, despite her best efforts, knew that Chopper's potential would never be realized. He had the skills to become a world-class doctor, but without the drive and encouragement that Luffy had given him in another timeline, he remained isolated, forever fearing the rejection of humans. One of Luffy's most defining moments had been his battle against Crocodile in Alabasta. He had fought against the Warlord of the Sea, defeated him, and saved Princess Vivi's kingdom from destruction. But in this world, things played out very differently. Without Luffy's intervention, Vivi was unable to uncover Crocodile's true intentions in time. Baroque works carried out their plan without resistance, igniting a full-scale civil war within the kingdom. The people of Alabasta, unaware of the real threat, fought amongst themselves as Crocodile watched from the shadows. When the war reached its peak, Crocodile seized the moment to strike. He eliminated King Cobra and declared himself the new ruler of Alabasta. With the ancient weapon Pluton hidden beneath the kingdom, Crocodile had a newfound power that made him even more dangerous. Vivi, heartbroken and desperate, attempted to fight back, but without allies, she stood no chance. In the end, she was captured and executed, her dreams of saving Alabasta dying with her. The once proud kingdom fell into despair, becoming just another stepping stone in Crocodile's quest for power. Nico Robin's fate had been deeply tied to Luffy's actions. He had been the one to offer her a new path, a family, and a chance to pursue her dream without fear. But in this timeline, Robin never had that opportunity. With no Luffy to defeat Crocodile, Robin remained under his command, continuing to work in the shadows of Baroque works. However, Crocodile's ambitions didn't stop with Alabasta. With his newfound power, he began making moves against other nations, using Robin's knowledge of poneglyphs to seek even greater weapons. Robin, trapped in a cycle of survival, was forced to continue aiding men like Crocodile, power-hungry criminals who saw her as nothing more than a tool. She never found the freedom she longed for. She never had a crew that cared for her. Her dream of uncovering the true history of the world became a distant memory as she remained on the run, forever hunted by the world government. In the original story, Luffy's arrival in Water 7 had set off a chain of events that ultimately led to Frankie joining the Straw Hats. He had been the one to stop CP9, the secret government agency, from obtaining the blueprints for Pluton. But with Luffy gone, there was no one to stand in their way. CP9 successfully captured Frankie, obtaining the blueprints for the ancient weapon. With no reason to release him, they imprisoned him, breaking his spirit and forcing him to work for the government. Water 7, once a thriving city of shipbuilders, fell under strict government control. The legendary shipwright, who had once dreamed of building a ship to sail the world, was reduced to a prisoner, his passion crushed under the weight of the world government schemes. Perhaps the most tragic fate of all was that of Brook, the skeletal musician who had once been the last surviving member of his crew. In the original timeline, Luffy had promised to reunite him with Laboon, giving him a new sense of purpose. But in this world, no one came for him. Brook remained trapped in the Florian Triangle, drifting aimlessly in his broken ship. The years passed, and his loneliness grew unbearable. His laughter, once a sign of joy, became hollow and meaningless. With no hope of ever reuniting with Laboon, Brook's will to live slowly faded. The once joyful pirate who had longed for companionship would spend eternity as nothing more than a forgotten soul, lost to the depths of the sea. Years passed, and Luffy continued sailing with Shanks and his crew. He had grown stronger, becoming one of the most formidable fighters in the red-haired pirates. But despite his power, he had never truly seen the full extent of the world's corruption. Until they arrived at Sabaody Archipelago, Luffy had always believed that pirates were the freest people in the world, but his beliefs were shattered when he stepped foot on Sabaody. As they explored the island, he was drawn to a large crowd gathered around a grand building. Curious, he pushed his way forward, only to witness something that made his blood boil. A young girl was being sold in a human auction. Her terrified eyes darted around the room as wealthy nobles placed bids on her life. Luffy clenched his fists, his body trembling with rage. "What is this?" Ben Beckman, standing beside him, remained silent. Before Luffy could react, a loud voice echoed through the hall. A celestial dragon had arrived. The room fell silent as a grotesquely dressed noble strolled in, his face hidden behind a bubble helmet. The celestial dragon, a member of the world nobles, took a seat and casually placed a bid, one so high that no one else dared to compete. Luffy felt his entire body tense. He wanted to rush forward, to stop this insanity, to punch the noble in the face. But before he could take a step, a hand gripped his shoulder. It was Shanks. "Not now," he said in a low voice. Luffy's anger boiled over. "What do you mean? Not now? This is wrong." Shanks' expression darkened. "I know. But if you fight here, you'll bring down the full force of the world government. You're strong, Luffy, but not strong enough to take on an entire system." Luffy clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He hated it. He hated feeling powerless. He hated that this was allowed to happen. For the first time in his life, he truly understood the evil of the world government. But as much as he wanted to fight, he had no choice but to hold back. Not because he was afraid, but because Shanks had warned him of the consequences. For now, all he could do was watch. Years had passed since Luffy first set sail with Shanks and the red-haired pirates. No longer the young, reckless boy who once dreamed of adventure, Luffy had become one of the most powerful warriors in the crew. His mastery of haki had reached extraordinary levels, his strength rivaling even some of the greatest pirates in history. But despite all he had learned, he had yet to reach his full potential. That moment came during one of the most dangerous battles of his life. The battle at Egghead Island. Before reaching Egghead, Luffy had already faced his greatest test yet, Kaido of the Beasts. When Shanks and his crew made the decision to liberate Wano, they knew they were up against one of the strongest creatures in the world. But Shanks, confident in his crew's abilities, led the charge. Luffy fought alongside Shanks during the siege of Onigashima, going up against some of the most fearsome enemies he had ever encountered. He faced Kaido's commanders, defeating Jack the Drought in a battle that lasted nearly an hour. His haki had reached the level where he could withstand devastating attacks and counter with incredible force. Eventually, the final showdown between Shanks and Kaido came. The two Yonko clashed with unimaginable strength, shaking the very island with their blows. But Luffy wasn't content with simply watching. He joined the battle, launching himself at Kaido with everything he had. For the first time, Luffy experienced the overwhelming strength of a Yonko firsthand. Kaido's sheer power was beyond anything he had ever fought before. Despite his mastery of armament and observation haki, he struggled to land a decisive blow. Kaido, in his dragon form, struck Luffy with brutal attacks that sent him crashing into the mountains of Wano. But Luffy refused to give up. With every hit he took, he got back up. His endurance and sheer willpower kept him fighting. And alongside Shanks, he helped push Kaido to his limits. The battle finally ended when Shanks landed a devastating final blow, cutting Kaido down with his full-force Conqueror's haki attack. The red-haired pirates had won, and Wano was freed. But the battle had taken its toll. Luffy, despite his incredible growth, realized that there were still levels of strength beyond what he had achieved. That realization would become even more evident at Egghead Island. Luffy's next major battle came when Shanks and his crew set sail for Egghead Island to rescue Dr. Vegapunk. The scientist held secrets that the world government desperately wanted to keep hidden, and the red-haired pirates knew they had to act fast. However, the Marines had anticipated their arrival. A massive fleet, led by Admiral Kizaru, had already surrounded the island. But the biggest threat wasn't the Marines, it was the Gorosei. For the first time in history, the five elders themselves stepped onto the battlefield. These weren't just government officials. These were monsters. Each of them wielded powers that defied logic, their presence alone suffocating the battlefield. Luffy, along with the red-haired pirates, charged into battle. Luffy found himself face-to-face with one of the Gorosei, a towering figure with an aura unlike anything he had ever felt. The battle began, and despite Luffy's incredible speed and strength, he was completely outmatched. The Gorosei fought with an ancient power, effortlessly countering Luffy's attacks and striking him down with attacks infused with an energy he didn't understand. For the first time in years, Luffy felt powerless. Then, it happened. One of the Gorosei landed a direct blow, piercing Luffy through the chest. Blood spilled onto the battlefield as he collapsed, gasping for air. The world around him grew silent. His heartbeat slowed. Then, thump-thump. A familiar rhythm echoed through his body. Thump-thump. The drums of liberation began to sound. As the battlefield shook, Luffy's body began to change. His hair turned white, his entire form glowing with an otherworldly light. His strength, his very essence, transcended human limits. Luffy had awakened his true power, the power of Nika, the sun god. The Gorosei's eyes widened in shock. "It's him," one of them muttered. "Joe Boy has returned." Luffy's body surged with Gear 5's limitless energy. His movements became cartoonish, his attacks defying logic itself. With a single stretch of his arm, he sent shockwaves through the battlefield, knocking back enemies with ease. The once overwhelming power of the Gorosei suddenly seemed laughable. His laughter echoed across the island, a sound that filled both his allies and enemies with awe. This was what true freedom felt like. Shanks, watching from a distance, couldn't help but grin. "Luffy," he muttered. "You really did it." Realizing that Luffy had finally unlocked his true potential, Shanks leaped into the fray. Together, Luffy and Shanks fought side by side against the Gorosei, unleashing attacks that shook the very sky. The red-haired pirates, inspired by their captain and Luffy, pushed forward with renewed strength. The battlefield was pure chaos, a war unlike any seen before. For a moment, it seemed like they could win. But then, something terrifying happened. The Gorosei didn't fall. No matter how many times Luffy and Shanks struck them down, they kept regenerating. Their bodies twisted and reformed as if nothing had happened. Even Luffy's Gear 5 attacks, which could bend reality itself, failed to land a finishing blow. It was then that Luffy realized the truth. These weren't ordinary enemies. The Gorosei were something beyond human, beyond devil fruit powers. They were immortal. Shanks gritted his teeth. "Luffy, we're leaving." Luffy, panting heavily, wanted to keep fighting. He could feel the power of Gear 5 coursing through him, urging him to push further. But even with his newfound strength, the Gorosei weren't going to die. For now, there was only one option: escape. Using his final burst of power, Luffy stretched his arm across the battlefield, grabbing both Shanks and Vegapunk. With one mighty pull, they launched themselves away from Egghead Island, retreating to the red-haired pirate ship. As they sailed away, the Gorosei watched them from a distance. They didn't pursue. They had seen enough. Luffy collapsed onto the deck, exhausted. His body was still glowing, his heartbeat still playing the drums of liberation. Shanks looked down at him, a serious expression on his face. "You've awakened something powerful, Luffy. But this isn't over. If we're going to win, we need to figure out what the Gorosei really are." Luffy, catching his breath, grinned. "Then let's find out." A new era had begun. Luffy and Shanks were closer than ever to uncovering the secrets of the world. And nothing, not even the Gorosei, could stop them now.